There we go.
Okay. So this is the fifth in a continuing series of discussions about the Workman and Temple families. The phrase there on rather hard terms will be very apparent to you towards the end. What we've done is we've brought the families to Mexican California back in the 1820s up to the 1840s, and we've gone by decade from there. So in the 1840s, the establishment of the families as ranchers and in some cases business owners, the Mexican-American War, and the onset of the gold rush. That takes us into the 1850s as the gold rush continued, and then it ended and there was violence and economic problems. So a lot of the ups and downs we experience in life. 1860s took us then to an era where there was a lot of extremes going on. This is an image from the late 1850s, very sanitized. It didn't look that clean, but it did give you a sense of how the town was still morphing from a Mexican era pueblo into a small American city. And during that first half of the 1860s, there were extreme floods, followed by extreme drought. And these are also things that happen frequently throughout our history. And we're dealing with some of that now in terms of the drought aspect of it. But then the last half of the 1860s, things started to change quite a bit. The end of the Civil War, a lot of folks began to migrate out from other parts of the country, the devastated South, but other parts of the United States too. And then you had an economic change happening. And on the population side, it's a little bit maybe hard to see some of this stuff, but I just want to point out that the population of the county in 1860 was about 11,000 people, and it grew to about 15,000 by 1870, but it's where it grew that changed quite a bit. Not so much, I mean, the city of Los Angeles went from about 4,400 to maybe a little under 6,000, but it's other areas of the community. I want to point out one, since some of you actually live in this area, Los Nietos, which is the Whittier, Norwalk, Santa Fe Springs, Downey area, had only 600 people in 1860. It went to 1,500 in 1870. There were 24 roughly Anglos in Los Nietos at that time. You can see it here, 12 Americans and 12 Europeans. And then when you get down to 1870, 1,068 Americans from 12. That's because of probably the Civil War is over and people begin to come out from other parts of the country. So what that means is that even as the Latino population, Californios, Mexicans and others, is growing somewhat, it's the Americans and European population that's really changing the complexion, literally, of the area between the 1860 and 1870. So to help us get a little bit of context for the 1870s, you get a sense from the demographics, the changing population, what's going on. Photography is also going to be seen quite frequently now. You didn't really have that in 1860, but by 1870 you do. And it's really great to have some documentation, as hard as these can be to find sometimes, and see what was going on. So the top left photograph shows where Spring and Main came together at Temple Street. They don't do that anymore. Spring has been rerouted to continue further north, but this was an area called the Temple Block. So the photographer was probably on the second floor of a building there, and then looking, in fact, over here, looking this direction. So you're looking up towards the plaza. This is the Pico House Hotel, if you know that, right by Olvera Street. The 101 goes through this building here, which was Abel Stearns' El Palacio, an old adobe structure, just to give you your bearing. But you can even see just by the amount of vehicles and all that, this was called the Downey Block. Former Governor John Downey built that. And so it was the center of activity. And what's also happening is the Mexican and Spanish center of town, the plaza, is starting to become less important as the Americans and Europeans are moving the downtown further to the south in this location of the Temple Block. And the economic growth means more stores and other businesses. There's not heavy industry or anything, but you're seeing blacksmiths and saddlers and people like that. And so it's starting to become more like what you see in a smaller American city. I think I'd seen somewhere that LA was the 247th largest city in the United States in the 1870s. That just shows you how rural America was, because it wasn't very big at all. But in any case, to them, it was a big change. They definitely saw a lot happen. And we're going to really focus primarily on these two guys today. William Workman, who established his ranch here at the homestead, where our museum is, and his son-in-law, Francis Pliny Fisk Temple. And the two of them are going to be joining together their fortunes for good or bad. And we'll find out a little bit of both in the course of our presentation here. These guys were primarily ranchers from the time they came here in the early 1840s all the way up. So think about the fact that for about roughly 25 or 30 years, that's what they knew and did: farming, cattle ranching, and all that. But they wanted to transition to becoming business people. And is that something that you can easily do when you're used to doing one thing really well and trying to move into something else? It can, or maybe it won't. And they were very successful at that. These are just a couple of articles that talk about some of the things they were doing. William Workman's mill at the Puente. So Workman Mill Road going down into Whittier, right off the 60 and 605. That's where his mill was located, right up against the Puente Hills. And he had a creek called San Jose to get the water from. It's cut off here a little bit, but this is from 1875. It says, Mr. Workman of the Puente Ranch informed this newspaper, I think it was the LA Herald, that a barley field of 300 acres had 4 crops, 3 of them volunteer, which sounds really unusual because you have a crop for your year, but you have 3 volunteer crops that just popped up during the course of the year. It seems to indicate that they had a very fertile soil out here and could do very well. And there's other evidence than just this, but I'm just giving you an example of how successful these guys were. Workman had been a cattle rancher until the floods and droughts really wiped out most of the industry in the area, but he still kept cattle into the 1870s. Some other examples here with the FPF Temple, the son-in-law. Temple's Ranchito, which is a little place near the Whittier Narrows, about 6 miles west of here, talking about how corn was being planted and appears to be in a more flourishing condition than usual at this time of year. This was 1871, but you got to watch out for the grasshoppers because that's a big problem almost anywhere you've got farming. Temple was also pretty active in setting up official organizations. So they created an agricultural society for what they call the Southern District of California. He was one of the principal figures of that. That group helped start Agricultural Park south of Los Angeles, which became Exposition Park, where the Coliseum is and Natural History Museum and all of that. And that's where that all got started from. It was guys like this starting to organize. And the fact that they were doing this shows how much things were changing. They wouldn't have had agricultural societies in the 1850s. They were just too busy trying to keep their thing going, but they had enough organization, money, leadership to be able to do some of this stuff. Now, obviously, if you look at the names, these are going to mostly be Americans and Europeans. The Spanish-speaking Californios are not typically part of these organizations. That just shows also how much things had been changing. All right, and some other examples of what Temple was doing. Also, the San Gabriel Valley had its own Farmers Club. So he is a treasurer of that, and he was treasurer because he was a banker by that point, which we'll talk about later. I will mention that William Workman's son, who we don't usually get much information about, Joseph, was responsible for the sheep and wool part of the club. He had a little ranch in what is now Bassett, a little bit west of here towards El Monte. But Temple was also very interested in horse breeding. Back in the early 1860s, he had purebred horses. And this article is from the 70s, where he's got Clydesdale. So think of Budweiser and the Clydesdale horses and all that. What's interesting is he doesn't raise these down here. He's got a place in Alameda County where he is breeding these horses. So he's one of those guys who's got activities throughout California, not just locally, which set him apart from most people living down here. But it's time also to start thinking about further expansion into business. So in the end of the Civil War and into the late 1860s, Temple did things like start a community called what became Compton, between Los Angeles and the harbor at San Pedro. He was also involved in the first edition of the Woolen Mill in Los Angeles, and then they reorganized in the 1870s, and he was treasurer of that. This is the Forest Grove Association. Eucalyptus trees were imported from Australia. And what I had heard was they brought the wrong gum. There's different gums of these trees. And the one that they brought, they thought would be good for building purposes, wound up not being for that. And so that's why you see eucalyptus trees being windbreaks to protect orange groves and stuff like that. This was a company that set up a grove near the San Gabriel River in Downey area, Downey and Norwalk. And so that was something that was an early example of trying to make commercial aspect for trees and how to sell those. In railroads, he was involved in a project called the Los Angeles and Independence, which was going to go to the city of this name up in Inyo County in Eastern California. There was a silver boom going on up in the mountains to the east of Owens Lake, if you know where that is. That's where we draw all this water now for the Los Angeles Aqueduct. And so the idea was to build that line, and instead of having the silver brought down by mule team or oxen, they would have a real railroad to do that. They weren't able to really get enough money initially until an investor came in from Nevada. He was a United States Senator named John P. Jones. And Jones was announcing a project on the coast called Santa Monica. And so he convinced, well, he bought most of the stock and then convinced people, we're going to build a line to Santa Monica first, and then we'll go up to Inyo County. Well, the Santa Monica line actually did get completed. The depot was in Los Angeles, 6th and San Pedro, a little bit south of downtown. It ended up very close to the shore here in this new town, and they built a wharf for the railroad right off about where the pier is in Santa Monica today. So they actually got some progress in this railroad. It never did get completed beyond that, though. Never got to Inyo County or anywhere close to it. Rapid transit systems, this was it in the 1870s. This is the whole thing, one horse, one car. But you got to start somewhere. And this is the Spring and 6th Street Railroad. The president was Robert Whitney, who was an attorney, a real estate speculator. He was a judge, also a founder of USC, although they've been taking his name off of buildings lately because he was supposed to have been a vigilante. And there's a lot of controversy now, of course, with people who have associations. And I know there's different viewpoints about that, but Whitney was a pretty important figure in those days. And again, Temple was treasurer of this little streetcar line. And it was the first, and you had cable, and you had electric, and now we're going back and trying to recreate some of that to greater or lesser degrees of success. And the Spring and 6th Street line is parked in front of the Pico House Hotel, one of the big landmarks here in Los Angeles, even today. Oil. The first oil drilling in this area took place in 1865, north of Los Angeles, what they call the San Fernando oil regions. This is off the Interstate 5 to your left as you're going north towards Six Flags. Would be Santa Clarita today. And Temple was involved in this too. He formed the Los Angeles Petroleum Refining Company, and they were drilling wells as others were in that location. They actually did produce a little bit of oil, which was not used for, well, basically used for illumination, for lighting and that kind of stuff. By the way, the Pico House Hotel did have gas fixtures when it was open. And so some of that actually was probably supplied from local sources. And across the street was where the gas works were located for that. So you can see that Temple's involved in tons of things. I'm not even giving you the full list, just some examples. And by association, it's his father-in-law, Workman, who's probably providing money, but not being really involved in what's going on. He's in his 70s. He's happy enough to be here at the homestead doing this thing. Another one I'll mention too, I forgot about this one. This is a shipping and warehousing group at the rudimentary harbor at San Pedro and Wilmington, kind of combined. This is what it looked like in the 1870s. We know what the harbor and the port is like now, massive endeavor, but this is kind of the early stages of that. And so people like Temple, Benjamin D. Wilson, Mount Wilson, named for him, a big investor, and Phineas Banning, who was called the Port Admiral. He was responsible for the Wilmington area. L.J. Rosemead, that was his thing. So you get some of the people who were really involved in some of the early business going on. To fund some of this stuff, though, you're going to have banks establishing. And banks were technically illegal from the 1849 Constitution of California. That later got changed. And what people did is they just formed corporations, gave themselves a name, and they just did banking without having bank in their title. So that's why, for example, the bank was called Temple and Workman, not the Temple and Workman Bank, just Temple and Workman. Now, they had a partner before in the late 1860s, a Jewish merchant named Isaiah Hellman, brilliant young man who knew what he was doing. And really, they should have let him just handle their bank. And they would probably still be here owning this property today, and I wouldn't have a job. But in any case, the original bank of Hellman, Temple and Company was located on the east side of Main Street. You can see the sign here. It says Bank of Los Angeles. This was a building built by Pio Pico, former governor of California. And then across the street is the Temple block. So when Hellman decided to buy out his partners because Temple had a different philosophy about how to run a bank, Hellman basically said, Temple's only qualifications for our borrowers that he must be poor. I don't want to be poor, so I am going to form my own bank. And so he started something called Farmers and Merchants Bank, which lasted for a long time, was one of the most successful institutions in this area. Hellman went on to run Wells Fargo and lots of other banks and was one of the wealthiest people in the Western United States. Like I said, Workman and Temple should have stayed with him and let him handle their affairs.
What's this rifle shooting?
Yeah, there was actually a shooting gallery in the Temple block, which is right off to the camera. I'll show you another picture of it, I think, later on that shows that. So what they did is they basically just moved across the street. That's where their bank had been, and Temple owned a succession of buildings on the west side of Main Street, and that's where the Bank of Temple and Workman opened up. And they called themselves the bank. There were two, but they were the only one that mattered. as they advertised here. And it was a big splash. They had a photograph taken. You can see how impressive this counter is. Nice carving on it, probably a granite or marble countertop, big impressive vault that you want the public to see, right? We have a strong, secure institution. Doors are wide open so you can peek inside. What's interesting about this photograph, they actually put some of the names on here, like FPF Temple's oldest son, Thomas, was a cashier. And Henry Ledyard was the manager of the bank with his fine mutton chops there. Future mayors and titans of power and industry were lined up at the counter. They want to show that, right? We have customers who are well-known people. But in the back, in parentheses, it says, or in quotes, Green, the janitor. And it turns out this is a black man who was in the Mexican-American War, was in California really early, lived here for many years, became a leader of the African-American community. And this might be one of the earliest photos of a black person in Los Angeles. It's early 1870s. But he's Green, the janitor, not Louis G. Green, his full name, because he's a black man as a janitor. Yes.
One of the questions that's right online was, why did they outlaw the banks? What did they think they were going to prevent?
Yeah, banking was a very speculative profession. There were people who got into it who were looking to make quick bucks, and there was no regulation from the government at all. So it was left to these banks to deal with it. So in 1837, for example, there was a huge depression because of banking failures across the United States. And a lot of states started to basically outlaw banks in their constitutions because they didn't want this repeat of the 1837 depression. And of course, we've learned our lesson. Our banks are so much better managed now than they were back then, right? Yeah, of course. Now, as these guys are transitioning, or at least diversifying from the agriculture and more into the business side of things, that'll reflect in their home. So the Temple family, for example, out at the Whittier Narrows, right near Whittier Narrows Park and the dam out there, they had an adobe building they had lived in since the early 1850s. This is the early 1870s. It had not changed much in 20 years. By the way, you can see the little irrigation ditch where they would slaughter animals right by the house, right by the, along the ditch there. You can see a laundry line or whatever is there. They did add, this is a later photo, and it's not in its glory days, but that's the same house that you see here. They added a second story to it, and then they built a French-style Second Empire brick house next to that because they had many kids and an extended family. And it's too bad we don't have a photo of this when it was better looking. This is many years later, but they did expand quite a bit. And out here at this property, the Workman house had also been a single-story home from the early 1840s to about 1870, basically a part in the middle here. And they added to the corners, built a second floor, all out of brick, and had architectural details added, and it really transformed the house. Now, just a few months ago in April, we were lucky enough to acquire a new photo. We only had this one before, and this is it. So this is the other side. So this is the north side of the building. This is to the southwest. It's actually a better quality in terms of seeing some of the details, but it really is quite a bit different than what they had before. And if you look back at the Pico House Hotel, maybe we go back. We got time to do that, I think. Right, where is it? Not too far back. The same architect who did this one worked on the Workman house, supposedly. So you can see, like with the arches and some of the details, that there's not that much difference between those two projects. And even the fencing, that was all pretty new. We actually have receipts for fencing being delivered at Anaheim Landing, which is a port that is now where Seal Beach is, where the Sangamo River empties into the Pacific Ocean. So he had fencing put in around his property to improve it, and grapevines in the back of his house. We still have grapevines back there now, whether one or more of them are the same, we don't really know for sure, but it's at least in the same place. So this is a house more befitting a banker, right? And a businessman than maybe a rancher would be. And we don't know why he did the remodeling when he did. Maybe it was just because it was time to do that, but it definitely would show his status per capita. And part of that is, how wealthy are these guys? And some sources suggest they were the wealthiest people in Los Angeles County. It depends on what you look at. On the left is income. So they listed anybody who had made $1,000 or more in a year. Now, of course, it's a big difference from our situation in terms of what a dollar is worth. But way in the bottom, FPF Temple was making almost $9,000 a year. And this is not the whole list, but he was maybe the second or third highest on the list at that time. This was property value. And this is not the whole list either, but he was at 152,000, and there was nobody higher as an individual other than a couple people and some businesses. Pio Pico was pretty close. up here at 138,000. But there's ways to kind of get an idea of how well they were doing, and it was not going to last, unfortunately. I want to bring in two other members of the Workman family into our discussion briefly, because they'll be really the focus of future presentations here. William Workman, who lived here, had a brother, David, who brought his wife and three sons out from Missouri in the middle 1850s. And William's brother drove cattle to the gold mines for William and was killed in an accident only about a year or so after arriving. So his widow and three sons then moved into Los Angeles. The older son died in a steamship explosion in the early 1860s. The remaining two, Elijah and William Henry, named for his uncle, got into the saddlery business and became pretty successful. And eventually these two got into things like the school board and city council and all of that. Later, William H. Workman became mayor of Los Angeles and city treasurer. So we'll talk more about his future career in some of these presentations going forward. But this was an article about their Workman Brothers saddlery and how successful it was in 1870. William Henry married a young woman named Maria Boyle, whose father was an Irishman who had been in Texas during the Mexican era, had survived a battle between an Irish group and the Mexican army. He was the only survivor, wound up in California in Los Angeles, and bought Pardo Blanco, a piece of property, White Bluff, across the LA River from downtown. And when he died in 1871, his daughter and her husband inherited that, and William H. and a couple of partners created Boyle Heights in the middle 1870s. His partners were Hellman, the banker who had been a partner of William Henry's uncle and FPF Temple, and a guy named John Lazarevich, who was from the Slavic region, the Balkans of Europe, and had married into the Lopez family, the original settlers of this location. And then I'm going to refer just briefly to the next generation of Temple family. This is William Workman's daughter, Antonia Margarita. She married FPF Temple, who's not in the picture for some reason. This is about 1869. It's got several of her kids and other people in it. And so I want to focus attention a little bit on some of her sons, especially at this point. We'll talk about maybe the daughters a little bit later in other presentations. There was an eldest son, this young guy here, Thomas. He was in the photo of the bank. I mentioned him, he was a cashier. So he was being groomed to succeed his father, work with him in the banking, and eventually succeed him and run the bank. Thomas was about 25 when the bank opened. He was called Lord Chesterfield because he had very impeccable manners. He was always dressed very nicely. He had a stylish home. Unfortunately, none of that lasted either. And then there's his younger brother, Francis, here on the right, and then Francis with a goatee and mustache. Francis was 2 years younger than Thomas, and he was being groomed to run this property out here for his grandfather. So he went and got a little bit of education, including back at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, where he apparently studied a little bit of engineering, but also was interested in winemaking. So he became the winemaker for his grandfather Workman here at the homestead. So one of them's going to stay with dad and kind of do the banking thing. The other one's going to be out here doing the ranching. How much they got to choose that, or that was their assigned lot in life, who knows. The third son, who was born in the early 1850s, was William. And William was sent to Santa Clara College and then to Harvard to study law. So apparently the idea with that was he would be his father's attorney and represent him in business. And so he was in Boston studying at Cambridge and Harvard until 1874. Then he went to England to the Inns of Court, which is where lawyers study in that part of the world. And that's where he was when he was suddenly called back home when a problem erupted here in Los Angeles. I also want to mention John, who was a teenager at this time, but he wound up eventually owning the homestead in the 1890s. So I'm going to introduce him now, and then we'll talk about him in a future talk. So these are the four oldest sons. There were two daughters born quite a bit later, and then two much younger sons. And we're going to pick up those stories of those four younger kids later in future talks. I also want to mention quickly that there was a brother of Antonia Margarita. So this is her. And then she had one brother who we don't really talk a lot about on our tours and all that for a couple of reasons. Joseph, who was a couple years younger, was sent back east as a young boy to get an education. So his sister never went to school. She couldn't even write her name. She wrote an X because girls were not expected to get an education back then. He was. So he was sent back to Baltimore, where his father had a sister living at that time. And then later, when his aunt died, he moved to Missouri with his father's brother. And when they came to California in the 1850s, he also joined them. But then he was promptly sent to the Central Valley to watch over cattle and horses and all that kind of thing for his brother-in-law and his father. And he stayed there for 15 years. In late 1869, he married in San Francisco. We just got this photograph in the collection 3 months ago, and we had never seen a photo of Joseph until we got this one, which is pretty cool. So this is him and his bride, his brother-in-law, FPF Temple, and one of FPF's kids. No William Workman. So there's no mom, no dad, no sister. Why that is, we don't know, other than that Joseph and his father did not get along at all. And so it's not a story to talk about in this context, but someday we'll figure out a way to do that. But in any case, Joseph, once he got married and was starting to settle down, his father did give him some land though. So he promptly moved here to Los Angeles. This is the 1870 census in July. Joseph Workman and his young wife, he's 37, she's 19, which is not uncommon at all. But they're in the Azusa Township, and that basically was where they were living in the Bassett area, very close to the San Gabriel River. And he's establishing himself as a sheep rancher here on the property. This is a map of the area showing Joseph's piece of land. We're down here. This is where our museum is today, Valley Boulevard, heading into El Monte. And so he was, like I said, very close to the San Gabriel River. And this is a Big Dalton Wash, which comes down from the San Gabriels and goes through Glendora and Covina and all that. So we'll pick up a little bit of Joseph's story later on as well, especially through his daughter, who was a silent film star in the 1910s. Kind of a cool little side note to that. All right, so things were looking good. They had a bank, they were involved in all these businesses, they were successful ranchers and farmers, and then the dime dropped. And this came about primarily because up in San Francisco, there was a big stock bubble. Virginia City, Nevada, if you've ever heard of that, it's north of Reno, lots of silver mining going on and lots of speculation. And so stock prices kept going up, and it got to be a bubble. And there was a guy named Elias J. Baldwin who realized that there was a bubble, and he was going to Europe. So he told his business manager, when the stock price goes to X level, sell. He goes to Europe, but he takes the key to his strongbox with him. So his manager couldn't sell the stock until he got back. When Baldwin got back, the price went much higher than he had told his manager to sell it. That's why his nickname was Lucky from that point on. He was called Lucky Baldwin. And he made $8 million at money at that time selling out his stock. This is in early 1875. He bought the Rancho Santa Anita, where the Arboretum is, Arcadia area, in the spring. And he was investing in land down here. And who were the two biggest landowners in the area? Workman and Temple. So Baldwin's keeping an eye on all this, okay? So what happened was, once Baldwin sold out, others started to sell too, and they were panicking. And that's when the Bank of California, which was overextended, collapsed and failed. The owner of the bank, the president, I should say, took a swim the next morning and was found floating in the bay. He had a stroke while he was doing that. FPF Temple was called the Ralston of Los Angeles because he almost had the same thing happen to him. I'll mention that later. In any case, the panic broke out in San Francisco. Here in Los Angeles, people start showing up at the banks, right? They want their money. And so a thunderbolt is dropped from a clear sky in San Francisco. And our banks have to take their bearings. You know, how are we going to get through all of this? And there were all these claims that there was surplus money invested on good business principles. Any of our banks are good for 4 times their liabilities. The media is going to try to make it sound like everything's just fine, which we still see today, right? So yeah, it just goes on and on. And what winds up happening is that the 2 commercial banks in town, Temple and Workman, and farmers and merchants, decide that they're going to mutually work together to try and stem the panic. And at first it was, we'll close our bank for a couple of days because they're having a county election also at this time. So they wanted to try and calm the waters. Then it became a month. The whole month of September, they were going to close down. Now, Isaiah Hellman, who was really running farmers and merchants, but he was in Europe on vacation. He was supposed to be on vacation for 6 months. It became 6 weeks. He left John Downey behind to run things. And Downey and Temple got together and said, let's work together to make this happen. Hellman was furious. When he got the telegram, he immediately came back home. He stopped in New York to get some ready cash, and he came back to LA. He did not want to close because if we close, that shows depositors something's wrong. And it made sense. That's why he brought a lot of money from New York when he came back to LA. Okay. And it got to the point also that when the election was happening, because FPF Temple is candidate for county treasurer. Uh-oh, that's not good, right? He even had to take a card out at the end of August, the day before the election, to say, I'm not withdrawing, because the rumor was he's going to step aside because he's got a problem with his bank. Oh no, I'm sticking through this. And then his competitor, Thomas Rowan, who was the existing treasurer, said, I don't know anything about this. As far as I'm concerned, we're still both running. And then at the bottom, the bank has to say, yes, we're still dealing with things. There's rumors going on about what's going on with the bank. Everything's going to work out just fine, right? Everything's going to be fine. And so there's just more about this too. Even some accusations that Mr. Temple only wants the treasurer's office for the money he could make out of the county funds, right? Now, how he would do that, I don't know, because there had to be some protection with the bank. But it's interesting to see some of these things in these political campaigns, or this accusation that the only reason he wants to be treasurer, or that people want him to be, is that he can provide money for the Republican presidential campaign. This was a Democratic town at this time. Everybody who held office was a Democrat. There were no Republicans. In fact, you didn't even call yourself Republican, you were independent in those days. So interesting to see the political part of this in addition to the economic side of it. But when the election happened, it turned out that the only Democrat who lost was the county treasurer. Temple won election on the day that his bank closed for 30 days in conjunction with farmers and merchants. So how would you like that as a voter? You just voted for somebody and now their bank's closing for 30 days. That's kind of weird, right? So what he's got to do, you get the pun there, no silver linings, get it? No? Okay, sorry. Temple is going to have 6 months before he becomes treasurer. So he's got plenty of time to try to figure out what's going to happen with his situation. And he goes to San Francisco several times. This is just reference to one trip that he made at the end of September. So this is September 30th. He's going to come back tomorrow having succeeded. This is October 1st. We regret to announce that owing to the non-arrival of Mr. Temple, the bank will not reopen for several days. So they're telling you things are going to be fine, and the next day, oh no, it's not going to be so fine. Okay, that never happens with our media today, of course. It took him 3 months to get a loan, early September to the end of November, about 3 months. And finally, he's in San Francisco, and on November 20th, he writes a letter from there to his father-in-law. This letter still survives. We have it here at the museum. And what it says is, I'm sorry it's taken so long. I've had a business of a disagreeable nature. No kidding. And I've made arrangements to get money so we can go on with our business, although on rather hard terms. But of two evils, we must choose the least. We'll come out all right in the end, of course. The idea is to collect as fast as we can money owed to us and then pay our depositors. And we'll learn a little bit about what that means. And he goes on to say, how terrible things were economically in San Francisco and all of that. The guy who was going to loan the money was Lucky Baldwin. All right, so finally they start announcing that Temple's going to come back from San Francisco. This is the end of November, and things are going to be great. And they do finally open December 6th. You can imagine people thinking from September 1 to December 6th, you've been closed all that time. How stable could you be, right? But they tried in the media to say it was okay. Never a greater display of confidence by the public than for this. Everything's working out just great. They had a big article in the 3 daily newspapers about what was going on as the money came in, and the detectives were there because there were stage robbers infesting the area, and the money comes in and everybody's all happy. And they also are going to have a banquet at the Pico House Hotel, and the mayor is going to be there and a bunch of business bigwigs. Baldwin shows up, and they have the dinner and they have the speeches and the 3 cheers and all that sort of thing, because again, things are going to work out just perfectly with all of this. So just some of the names they were printing in the paper of prominent people who were at this. They even tried to get Baldwin to say something. He said no, but they went ahead and did a cheer for him anyway. What are you going to say? He's just waiting to see what's going to happen with all of this. All right, it took about 5 weeks for all that money, and it was $210,000 at first, and then very quietly Temple Workman asked for another sum of money, so he gives $100,000. Then they ask for a little more, and he gives them $30,000. So you see what he's doing. It's like, I'll give you this pot, and then a little more, or a little less, and a lot less, and then I'm done. So it was $340,000. But on January 1st, when they want to talk about New Year's and how everything's going to be great, they say, oh, this is the bank has the confidence of the community. These guys have large wealth. The depositors are amply protected. But when you borrow money, what are you doing to secure it, right? you're mortgaging your property. So how can they be men of large wealth when they just mortgage everything to Baldwin for this loan? They talked about the fact that, yes, there was a panic and he had to obtain the necessary coin, but there was no clamor on the part of the depositors. Everything was fine. Capitalists would use their faith and all that sort of thing. But this is January 1. On January 13th, they closed. Put a card on the door saying closed, and it never reopened. So the local papers started to try to analyze what's going on. One of them talked about the fact that amongst our people, there's been nothing but the greatest friendliness and respect towards Temple and Workman. Temple especially was very popular as an individual. That would not stay that way, but at this point he still was. And they went out and interviewed some of the local bankers about what they thought was going on. And of course, they're going to say, our bank's fine. And don't worry about that because they're wealthy people. They'll be able to pay their creditors and everything's going to be work out to be just fine. And it was not fine. Again, here you see some other examples of what they're trying to do in the media here. Oh, this suspension won't really be, it won't seriously affect things. It won't be that big a deal. I mean, look what happened to the bank in California, that was some months ago, and yeah. So it's talking about things as if it's going to work out not too bad. Then they had to do the inventory. So first you basically assign all your property over to people who are appointed to go through the records and figure out what's going on. And so there's an inventory done. The assignees included a former partner of Workman and Temple in some real estate deals and the cashier of one of the other banks. And they go through the books. And this is an article in one of the papers. It doesn't really say too much other than just factually speaking. They list the names of people. Here's one, Turnbull. We have a Turnbull Canyon here. That's Robert Turnbull. He had $6,000 deposited. No, maybe it's a CD, probably a certificate of deposit, something like that. This is cash deposits. John Hollenbeck, you may know that name from this area, is Hollenbeck Avenue in Covina. He had $20,000 he deposited, just coming from Nicaragua, where he'd been living for many years, and then lost all his money and had to get more. But also the city of LA deposited their money with the bank. They were promised 7% per year interest. And guess how much money they got back out of that?
Less than 7%.
Less than 7%, minus 7%.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. On the right here, a critical examination of the statement reveals some of the most remarkable curiosities of looseness in the business of this strict and exacting character. Not that banking was that strict and exacting in many ways, that we remember ever to have seen developed in the affairs of a financial institution conducted by honorable and responsible men. That was polite compared to the Los Angeles Star, which said, a document that shocks the community, mismanagement, wild speculations, and a betrayal of trust, an unparalleled array of deadbeats, and so forth. And the Star even used terms like, we are sick to hear about what has gone on. Basically, it was what Hellman was warning about in 1871. There were a lot of people who were loaned money who did not have the means to pay it back. Yes?
Did the bank fail because of bad loans to private people? Or was there embezzling, or was there gambling? How was the money lost?
There was a combination of things going on. Yeah, the question was about why the bank failed. Was it the loans to people who couldn't pay back, or was it more about embezzlement, bad decisions, investing? It was a lot of things. So for example, there was a lot of investment in companies that were trying to do things. It's a boom. So people are trying to do a lot of things in business with the oil and railroads and what have you. One example is that Temple had a project up in the silver mining areas of Inyo County to bring water 11 miles to a town called Cerro Gordo. And they built the pipeline, the water came rushing down for 2 years, and then the spring dried up. When that happened, all that money that they invested was gone because they didn't get the returns back then. So that was an attempt to do something useful. It was just bad luck. That happened. But there were also loans made to Thomas Temple, his son, who was the cashier, tens of thousands of dollars. There were monies that were shown in inventory for his election campaign for county treasurer, right? So we know those things happen too. So yes, it was a combination of things. Some well-intended, some that appear to be very, very questionable at the least. Yes.
For clarification, and if you can repeat this too, is this the same Hellman as the baker?
Oh, in terms of Hellman as a banker,
Not banker, baker.
oh, bakery, no. No, and not,
Helms?
that's Helms Bakery, but there's also a mayonnaise. It's Heilman or something like that. No, it's not the same. Yeah. Okay. So by all accounts, this was an unmitigated disaster, what had happened. They even found that the basic indexing of the books, just a basic accounting function, hadn't been done since maybe the second year of the bank. It just stopped doing essential things. And initially, a lot of the attention was placed on the managing cashier because he was the manager. It was his job to do the day-to-day things. At the same time, you've got a president. So it's one of those issues of, does it stop? Where does the chain of command go with this? How much culpability does FPF Temple as president of the bank have as opposed to his manager? Or as opposed to his own son, who's a cashier? Whereas William Workman, the 76-year-old guy who's a silent partner, his money's there, but he's been out here. He never went to the bank and did anything. He is caught up in a very difficult position, clearly. So as I said, they had to go into assignment. And so you had a couple of guys first who were brought in to do this. After about a year, they were replaced by another gentleman. There was a lot of dissatisfaction by creditors, which is understandable. I don't know how much of it is to be blamed on these guys because, again, if you want to pay back the creditors, you got to have something to sell. And if most of the property is tied up in the mortgage, there's very little that you can do. And occasionally you'll find things in the newspapers about having bonds or things that they would sell. And that could be, say, $100 worth of something they'd sell for $1. It was pennies on the dollar kind of thing. So creditors probably got almost nothing back from this. The only real beneficiary in the end was Lucky Baldwin because of the way he structured this loan. And that loan was deliberately set up. When Temple said on rather hard terms, he was not kidding. It was, the interest was, a certain amount per month, compounded monthly, and it wound up within 3 years, the interest was probably 70% of the original amount. So the $340,000 wound up being close to $600,000 within 3 years. And he waited that long to foreclose for a reason, because he wanted that interest to accumulate so that nobody could actually redeem the debts. That would be him doing that. You'll see a brief reference to that at the end. And again, you could have a 2-hour presentation just on all this disaster stuff that was going on with the bank, but it was something else. And yet, he's going to have to take over as county treasurer in March. He waited 6 months for officers of the county to take over back then, not like now at all. And so it was March when he finally showed up at his former rival bank. That must have been really fun for him to walk into Farmers and Merchants and then have to basically turn in his certificates and his sureties. They passed ordinances in the city. They even changed state law so that county treasurers in certain counties, like Los Angeles, had to have a group of examiners to check the records every so often, which makes sense because, again, you've got a guy who's a failed banker as county treasurer. Why he didn't resign or why nobody asked him to is really interesting. He served his 2-year term. But he did his job. He had a deputy, the same guy who had been an assignee to the bank and who was a bank official himself, was the deputy. He did all the work. Temple just basically was ceremonial as the treasurer. William Workman had a visitor on May 17th, 1876. It was a receiver sent by a court. And receiver basically is taking possession of your property legally pending the results of the proceedings against you. That night, Workman committed suicide. So he must have thought, obviously, that it was done. He was going to lose everything. And whether that was going to happen or not, we can't say for sure, but he obviously felt that way. Yes.
Where did he commit suicide?
In his house.
Okay.
The question was, where did he commit suicide? It was in the Workman house. We pretty much know where, because it talks about adobe walls deadening the sound, and the room was next to his bedroom, and you kind of know where that is. So it's actually on the tour, and we actually talk about all this stuff there. So he did. Yeah, it was a gun. Yeah, he did. And when the news was propagated in the papers, you could tell it was a big deal because he had been here for 35 years. He was one of the wealthiest citizens, that kind of thing. And I think also people realized just how bad the economic picture really was, despite what the media was trying to say all that time. Oh, it'll be fine. We'll work all this out. When you've got someone like that taking their own life, it has a big impact. So that's why the story isn't just about him. It's about the environment in which he was living. Temple had a series of strokes very shortly after that. And he was incapacitated. He was paralyzed, partially paralyzed. He lived 4 more years, but when he died at only 58, he had had several strokes. So this was obviously a huge disaster for the family, but also a big impact. This was the first real business failure in Los Angeles of any significance. And we're used to hearing about that, banks that go belly up and all that. This is the first time they had experienced it in this little city. And so foreclosure did not happen for 3 years. And this is 1879 when this was done. Interestingly, Baldwin assigned this to another person, a guy named Camilo Martin. I don't know why. There must have been a reason why he did that, but it was effectually Baldwin was taking over this property just through another third party. And so they had a sale through a circuit court in San Francisco, and they actually showed the value of property as it was assigned at that point. So Rancho La Puente, which is our property here, part of Rancho La Puente, 300 grand. That was about 18,000 acres, by the way, $300,000. Other properties, Rancho Portero Grande, which is South El Monte, a little bit of Rosemead, 90,000, et cetera. So different properties in the area. You see the total amount was 558,000. So that 340,000 plus interest got you to there and probably a little bit beyond that. And so that's why Baldwin waited so long. He wanted that interest to build up so that nobody else could go to the sale and outbid him. It was going to be his property. But he was sitting on way more than $558,000. In fact, later on, some of this property had oil on it after he died, and his two daughters, who were already filthy rich, made a lot more money. So the Baldwin Hills of LA, that was partly owned by Workman and Temple at that time. That's what's the Baldwin Hills now, as well as the Montebello Hills. That was also an oil property that these guys, Baldwin was able to realize a fortune on through his daughters anyway. Okay, so to wrap up, the future is going to take us into the 1880s next time around. And I'm going to focus some attention on that, on the unfortunate widow of FPF Temple, William Workman's daughter. So her husband's had strokes, he's died, her father committed suicide, and she's going to have to try and raise her family, including 4 minor children. And she's got her 4 adult sons who are fighting each other over things. We'll go into that at that time. And how difficult it must have been for her as an uneducated woman trying to figure out how she's going to deal with all of this. That would be a big part of the story next time. Meanwhile, one of her sons, Francis, does buy from Baldwin 75 acres of the homestead here. That's what I was saying earlier. I don't know if William Workman would have been left without anything. I think Baldwin might actually have given him a little bit of land because he did that for a friend of theirs who was tied up in all of this. But Workman wasn't thinking about that at the time, obviously. He was depressed. But anyway, we'll pick up the story with the family as they're dealing with the aftermath of the bank failure. And there's a lot to go through with that. And then also, I'm going to also talk about the branch of the Workman family in Los Angeles, because it's in the 1880s when William Workman's nephew, William Henry, becomes mayor of LA. And a lot is happening during that period of time. So just some examples of how we'll continue the story next time around. So we don't have a date yet, but we'll announce that when we do. And hopefully you can come back and join us for that. In the meantime, we have some upcoming events to point out to you. Our fiction book club. The theme of siblings is going to meet on Wednesday, the 21st of this month, and again, Wednesday, August 18th at 6 p.m. And that is both in person and virtual as well, I believe. Our nonfiction book club, which has been meeting for a while, is discussing Civil War barons, and that will be August 6th. We have somebody here who's a regular attendee who can tell you more about how great that is. And then my colleague, Jenny Trulock, is going to talk about, as part of our Female Justice series, a very interesting case involving the District Attorney of Los Angeles County, Thomas Lee Woolwine, and one of his employees, Ida Wright Jones, who no longer became an employee because they had something going on. And she brought it up, and he didn't like that. So it's pretty interesting story. So definitely check out that. And you can sign up for those programs at homesteadmuseum.org/upcoming events. And we can be followed with this tag at Homestead Museum on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as it's more commonly known. Okay, so with that, I'll be happy to take any more questions, and thank you guys for coming out today and being with us.
Live applause.
Thank you.
Live.
Yeah, live applause is nice. So a little applause emoji you get on.
You talked about the Baldwin assigning someone else to handle that. I'd imagine the reason you do that is so you don't have to go to court, you don't have to do all the filing, you don't have to. If you're trying to run what Baldwin was running, taking care of something else could be, and eventually you can't do everything.
Yeah, it's a good point.
You have to be in court, you have to be able to address these things.
Yeah.
And that's the whole reason why you assign someone. And you hire a lawyer to represent you or someone for your interests. So.
Yeah, and Camilo Martin was a banker. And I think he had a law degree or something like that. So maybe he understood how to do that better.
Right.
And Bowen said, hey, you do it and I'll make it worth your while, right? That could be what it was.
You're off doing whatever you do for running your interest than trying to deal with something else.
Yeah,
And there's deadlines and stuff if you miss them.
right.
You know about banking, you brought this up. Do you know about the FDIC? When did that come into play?
That will be in the 30s, there'll be a new
Okay,
deal.
so after the crash. Okay.
Yeah, we had the Glass-Steagall Act and stuff like that in the 30s, 1933. Was FDIC. Yeah,
So I'm curious, the women initially owned this land and then they married Temple and Workman. Once they married, was the land no longer in their control, but in their husband's control?
okay, that's a good question. The question was about women and property and how that was all being handled. In this case, William Workman was a citizen, a Mexican citizen, because he lived in New Mexico. So he could get land in his own right. In other cases, though, you might have somebody who would come from the United States or from Europe and marry into a family and then get property that way. Women could own property in the Mexican and Spanish systems. In the United States, that was not typical, real property, meaning like land. So in this case, it's the men could do that. But one of the things William Workman did is that he sold land to his daughter, for like, it's called a straw deed, like $10 or whatever. He transferred land to his daughter, maybe to protect land for the family so that if something happened to him, it would still remain that way. And that's what did take place after this bank failure, is that she had property in her name that she kept. But there's a thing called land rich, cash poor. So you can have all the land in the world, but you still have to pay taxes on it. And if you can't make it productive and be able to pay those taxes and all that, you could get in trouble. And that's what's going to happen to her later on. So yeah, that's the tricky part about that, is that you do have examples, like you said, where Anglo men came in and married into local families and got land that way.
So the women did lose their rights to property once they married?
No, they didn't.
They did not.
You could have your own separate property because of existing Mexican and Spanish law. Yeah, and in most of the United States, though, once you married, that property went to your husband. Not in California, but in real practice, what does that mean? So like the nephew who did Boyle Heights, he developed Boyle Heights. Now, maybe she was okay with that, but it was really her property because she was the heir to it.
I'm just wondering when it came down to bankruptcy, if they could finagle, oh, that's my property, not my husband's, he made these decisions without me. And
Yeah, and I didn't go into it, but what the Workmans and Temples tried to do when the bank closed, they tried to homestead their property, and you could do a maximum amount, I think it was 50 acres or something. Tried to save it, but it was too late because they'd already gotten in trouble before they homestead. You can't do it that way. But the other way around, like I said, was maybe you just assign some of your land to your wife. That way it's hers. And if something happens to you, you still have some land. But there are examples of women who did get land grants too. So Rancho La Merced, where the Temples lived in Winter Narrows, was granted to Casilda Soto de Lobo. She was a widow. It was to her. So there were occasions where women actually got property. But then she got into financial trouble, borrowed money from William Workman. He foreclosed on her and took that land. And what happened to him 25 years later? He got into trouble, borrowed money from Baldwin, and got foreclosed on and lost that. But so, yeah, so women could own property, whether they had control over it in terms of their marriage or whatever is a different story, like socially, but legally they could.
Did Temple face any criminal charges for any of the stuff he did?
He did. He tried to get his managing cashier Ledger indicted for embezzlement. Oh, the question was about whether there was any legal ramifications, criminal ramifications for FPF Temple as president. So yeah, he did try to get his cashier indicted for embezzlement. It didn't go anywhere.
I guess if there weren't a whole bunch of laws and regulations and things, he didn't really break them. So I guess that came later. Yeah.
And sometimes having bad records works in your favor that way. If you didn't keep track of what you were doing, unlike what we're hearing with certain people now, where like there's stuff on the side, books on the side and all that.
You
Then
can't recreate something that's not there.
Right, exactly. So that could be what it was. It wasn't enough to be able, I'm sure they looked into it. But, yeah. Any other questions online or anything, Jen?
No, mainly everybody online is just saying thank you very much for our hybrid program, and it's been very interesting to learn more about the families in the 1870s. It's been very, very inspiring and good to hear these continuing stories.
Great. All right, well, join us again for future programs. And again, thank you all for coming down today and for joining us online. Appreciate it.
And thank you all very much for joining us online today. Hopefully we will see you again for August 8th Female Justice or one of our book clubs. Also, as a reminder, we will be sending out an evaluation online, which you should receive in your email boxes by Monday morning. Thank you all again so much, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon.